Welcome back to the channel. Here, we share intense personal stories about family, betrayal, survival, and the moments that change a life forever. If this kind of story pulls you in, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. I grew up in a house where I was technically part of the family, but never truly included in it. From the outside, everything looked ordinary enough, but inside those walls, there was always one person who mattered more than anyone else, and that person was my older brother, Mason. He was the center of every conversation, every decision, every ounce of sympathy my parents had to offer. I was just there, like a chair in the corner no one noticed unless it was in the way. Mason was 6 years older than me, and from the moment I was born, it was obvious he did not want me around. I was told later that he used to scream whenever my mother held me too long, or whenever my father tried to give me attention. At the time, people laughed it off like it was some harmless phase, but it never really stopped. It just evolved. As we got older, his resentment turned into something darker. If I had a toy, he would snatch it away. If I got praised at school, he would find some way to ruin the moment. If I had a birthday, he made sure it became about him. I still remember those birthdays more for the dread than anything else. There was always a scene. He would yell, cry, shove decorations off the table, smash things, or suddenly claim he was overwhelmed and needed everyone's attention right away. And every single time, my parents reacted the same way. They would rush to calm him down and then turn to me with that familiar expression, the one that said I was expected to understand. They always used the same words too. Be patient. He's struggling. Don't make this harder. That word, patient, followed me through my entire childhood like a punishment. It was never a lesson they gave him. It was a burden they placed on me. When I was little, I thought maybe this was just how older brothers behaved. But it wasn't. Mason wasn't just moody or difficult. He was cruel. He shoved me into walls, knocked things out of my hands for no reason, and would lash out physically whenever he felt irritated. A few times he even bit me hard enough to leave marks. It sounds ridiculous saying it now, but when you are a kid and the person tormenting you is bigger, older, and protected by everyone around you, it feels terrifying. What made it worse wasn't only him. It was the fact that my parents always had an excuse ready. They called it stress, frustration, miscommunication, roughhousing, anything except what it actually was. I would try to tell them that I was scared of him, that he hurt me, that I hated being left alone with him, and they would respond as if I were the one being unreasonable. My mother would sigh and say I was too sensitive. My father would remind me that family means supporting each other. If I cried, they would say I was escalating the situation. Sometimes I would sit alone in my room after one of Mason's outbursts, trying to convince myself maybe they were right, maybe I was dramatic, maybe I really was the problem. But even then, in the quiet moments, I knew something about our family was deeply wrong. Mason also had trouble with other kids. He never kept friends for long. My parents tried to arrange playdates when he was younger, but those usually ended badly. He would get possessive, rude, or aggressive, and the other children would stop coming around. As for me, I adapted in the only way I knew how. I became quiet, easy, invisible. I kept my head down, did well in school, caused no trouble, and asked for almost nothing. But being the child who asks for nothing does not make people value you more. It just makes them forget you even faster. One of the clearest memories I have from those years happened when I was 13. I begged my parents to take me on a short trip to a theme park a few hours away, just the three of us. I had never asked for anything like that before. I wanted one day that belonged to me, one memory that would not be swallowed by Mason's chaos. After a lot of pleading, they finally agreed. For one brief moment, I thought maybe things could be different. Then Mason found out. He completely lost it. He screamed so loudly the neighbors could probably hear him. He knocked over a lamp, hurled a mug at the kitchen wall, and shouted that if we went without him, he would make sure I regretted it. I was shaking. I thought my parents would finally put their foot down. Instead, they turned to me, looking exhausted, and started asking if I could just let him come so things would calm down. I remember standing there in disbelief while they begged me to sacrifice the one thing I had asked for. I gave in because I always gave in. And the trip was exactly the disaster I knew it would be. Mason complained the entire drive, refused to go on rides, clung to my mother, shouted about the noise, and made every second of that day about his discomfort. I came home feeling emptier than before we left. That was the moment I stopped hoping my family would ever change. As I got older, the resentment inside me built slowly, layer by layer. It was never just one huge event. It was 1,000 smaller ones stacked on top of each other. A school project I had spent days working on, destroyed by Mason because a teacher had complimented me. A night my father lectured me about compassion after Mason shoved me so hard I slammed into a doorframe. A dinner where I tried to explain how isolated I felt, only to be told I needed to think about how hard things were for him. My parents were not monsters in the obvious way people imagine. That almost made it worse. They were the kind of people who genuinely believed they were doing their best, while failing me so completely that I started fantasizing about disappearing from that house forever. Leaving was not a dramatic decision made in one night. It was something that formed quietly over years. By the time I was 17, I was researching colleges in places so far away they felt like another world. I didn't want a school 2 towns over. I didn't want a life where I could be pulled back every weekend to play emotional caretaker in a house that had already drained everything out of me. I wanted distance. I wanted a chance to become someone outside of my assigned role. When my parents found out I was applying out of state, they reacted like I had betrayed them. I still remember the night I told them. We were at the dinner table. I said, as calmly as I could, that I had applied to a university across the country. My mother froze. My father put down his fork and stared at me like I had just announced I was disappearing forever. My mother asked why I would want to go so far when there were good schools nearby. I told her I needed something different, that I wanted to build a life of my own. That was when my father said something that split my entire life into before and after. He said, "Your brother needs you here. You know how hard things are for him. You can't just walk away." I asked him why Mason's needs were always my responsibility. He got frustrated, and then the truth came out. He said, "We had you so he would always have someone." I don't think he even realized what he had admitted until the room went silent. My mother immediately tried to soften it, saying he didn't mean it like that, saying of course they loved me, saying I was part of the family plan. But that only made it worse. Family plan. In one awful instant, my whole childhood made sense. I had always felt like I existed for a purpose I never chose. That night confirmed it. I was not just overlooked. I had been born into a role. I was the backup, the future caretaker, the extra child meant to absorb the cost of their first one. I went to my room that night feeling colder than I had ever felt in my life. I didn't cry. I didn't argue anymore. I just made a promise to myself. No matter what happened, I was leaving. The months after that were brutal. I pushed myself harder than ever in school. I took extra shifts at my part-time job. I saved every bit of money I could. I kept most of my acceptance letters to myself until I had a real plan. When I finally told my parents I had chosen a school thousands of miles away, they reacted exactly how I expected. My mother cried. My father accused me of abandoning the family. They threatened to cut me off financially, which would have been terrifying if they had ever actually set aside much for me in the first place. But by then I had already spoken to my grandparents. They were the only people in the family who ever really saw what was happening. They offered me a place to stay for the summer before school started and promised to help however they could. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough. The day I packed my bags and left my parents' house, I felt like I could breathe for the first time. They tried one last round of guilt on me before I walked out. I didn't look back. The summer with my grandparents was the first peaceful stretch of my life that I can clearly remember. My grandmother made sure I ate. My grandfather talked to me like I mattered. Neither of them tried to force me into forgiving anyone. They just helped me stand up. When I got to college, freedom was harder than I had imagined, but it was still freedom. I was broke almost immediately. My parents followed through on cutting me off, not that there had been much to lose. I took out loans, worked late shifts at a restaurant near campus, and learned how to survive without a safety net. There were nights I got back to my tiny apartment so exhausted I could barely take off my shoes. There were days I felt like every other student had entered adult life with a map and I had been shoved into it blindfolded. But even at my most overwhelmed, I preferred that life to the one I had escaped. No one there told me to make myself smaller for someone else. No one expected me to swallow pain to keep the peace. No one made me feel guilty for wanting basic dignity. Emotionally, college was when everything I had buried finally started surfacing. In high school, I had been too busy surviving to really process what my family had done to me. But once I was on my own, all those memories started replaying at night. I would lie awake thinking about how often I had begged for help and how often I had been treated like the inconvenience. What hurt most was not just what Mason did. It was how little effort my parents made once I was gone. Months passed, then years. No birthday messages. No calls to ask if I was okay. No small attempts at reaching out. Their silence made something painfully clear. If I refused to play the role they had created for me, I had no value to them. My grandparents stayed in touch and kept me updated about the family when I wanted to know. According to them, Mason handled my absence badly. Without me around to absorb his anger, he started turning it outward more openly. He lashed out at neighbors, threw things, picked fights, and made life miserable for everyone around him. A small part of me felt guilty hearing that, like maybe my leaving had triggered the chaos. But another part of me felt relief so strong it almost scared me. For once, his behavior was no longer landing on me. Meanwhile, my own life slowly started becoming real. I made a few good friends, the kind who liked me for who I actually was, not for how useful I could be. I worked hard in school and graduated with a job already lined up. My grandparents came to my graduation. They looked prouder than anyone had ever looked at me before. My parents never contacted me about it. They did not come, and they did not ask about it later. That stung, but not in a surprising way. It was just one more confirmation of what I had already accepted. After graduation, I moved to a different city and started my first full-time job. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough for me to breathe a little easier. For the first time, I had stability. I started paying down my loans. I even paid back my grandparents for some of what they had spent helping me, even though they never asked. During all of this, my grandparents occasionally mentioned that things at home were getting worse. Mason had started harassing neighborhood kids, screaming at them for walking near the house, splashing water on them, and acting like the street belonged to him. Eventually, one of the parents called the police. He was arrested after a confrontation, and suddenly my parents were facing legal trouble, bills, and consequences they had spent decades trying to avoid. Even then, they still did not contact me. And honestly, I liked it that way. I had spent my entire childhood chasing their approval. By then, I was done. Then one afternoon, 6 years after I had walked out of that house, my phone rang and my father's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds, convinced it had to be a mistake. My chest tightened before I even answered. Something in me already knew this was not going to be about reconciliation. I picked up anyway. His voice sounded older, weaker, worn down in a way I had never heard before. He asked how I was, as if that question meant anything after 6 years of silence. I gave him a flat answer and asked what he wanted. He hesitated, then said he and my mother had been thinking a lot and wanted to put the past behind us. He said they missed me and wanted to make things right. I almost laughed. It sounded rehearsed, empty. I asked him again what he really wanted. That was when he sighed and admitted Mason was in serious trouble. The complaints from the neighborhood had escalated. The court case was real. There were lawyer fees. There was talk of mandatory treatment. They were stretched thin and didn't know what to do. Then he finally got to the point. He said they had heard I was doing well now, and maybe I could help them out financially. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. 6 years. 6 years without a call, a text, a single sign that I still mattered to them, and this was why they reached out. Not because they loved me, not because they regretted what they had done, because they needed money for the same son they had allowed to torment me for most of my life. I asked him if he was serious. He started talking about family, about hard times, about how Mason was struggling and how I was his sibling and should care. That was it for me. Everything I had buried came rushing out. I told him exactly what he and my mother had done. I told him they had let Mason make my childhood miserable while they stood by and called it patience. I told him they had ignored me, erased me, and treated me like I existed only to serve him. I told him they did not get to vanish for 6 years and then show up at my door asking me to pay for the consequences of their parenting. He tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. I said I was not responsible for Mason, had never been responsible for him, and would not spend one more day carrying a burden that was never mine. Then I hung up. After the call, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. I was furious, but underneath the anger was something uglier. Hurt. The kind that comes from realizing people really can be exactly as selfish as you feared they were. Later that evening, my mother sent me a long message. It was full of apologies, regret, promises to do better, admissions that they had failed me when I was younger. But even in the middle of all that remorse, the real purpose of the message was still there. She wanted help. She said Mason was in a terrible place and could not get through it alone. I read it twice and didn't answer. Part of me wanted to tell her to never contact me again. Another part of me hated that I still felt guilty. That was the hardest thing to admit. Even after everything, some broken part of me still worried that I was being cruel for saying no. That is what years of emotional neglect do to you. They train you to question your own boundaries. Over the next few days, I kept turning it over in my head. Was I being too harsh? Should I give them another chance? Or was this just the same manipulation wearing a different face? Every time doubt crept in, I went back to the facts. They had ignored my pain for years. They had abandoned me the moment I stopped being useful. They only came back when they needed something. That was not love. That was desperation. I talked it through with my grandparents, and my grandfather said something that cleared the fog in my mind. He said, "You do not owe people access to you just because they share your blood." Hearing that felt like someone unlocking a door inside my chest. He reminded me that I had already given enough. I had spent my childhood adjusting myself around Mason's rage, sacrificing my comfort, my safety, my voice, also my parents could avoid dealing with reality. I had done more than enough for that family. In the weeks that followed, my grandparents kept me loosely informed. Mason's court date came and went. He was ordered into treatment and given strict conditions after the incidents with the neighborhood kids. My parents were under serious financial strain from legal costs, fines, and everything else they had postponed for years by pretending there was no real problem. My grandmother said my mother still believed she could somehow manage everything alone. Even now, even after it had all fallen apart in public. That part didn't surprise me. My parents had spent so long protecting the illusion of control that they did not know how to function without it. A while later, my father tried contacting me again from another number. The message was short. He said they were sorry if they had hurt me and asked me to give them a chance to talk. I stared at it for a long time, wondering whether any response would make a difference. In the end, I said nothing. Silence was not punishment. It was protection. If they genuinely wanted to rebuild anything, they would have to do it without dragging me back into the same role. Not with a sudden emotional plea. Not with guilt. Not with money. They would need years of truth, accountability, and change, and by then I no longer needed their version of family anyway. Slowly, for the first time in my life, that chapter began to feel like it was closing. The pain didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when old memories caught up with me, or when I wondered what my life might have looked like if I had grown up in a home where I mattered equally. But those thoughts no longer controlled me. I had my own apartment, my own work, my own friends, my own plans. I had built a life brick by brick without them. A few months later, after years of saving, I booked a solo backpacking trip through Europe. It was something I had dreamed about since I was a teenager stuck in that house, imagining a world bigger than the one that kept trying to define me. Before I left, I visited my grandparents. We spent the day together talking, laughing, remembering things that had nothing to do with pain. Before I headed out, my grandfather looked at me and said, "You survived more than most people know. Don't let anyone take away what you built." I carried those words with me. When I got on that plane, I looked out the window and thought about how far I had come. My parents might never truly understand what they did to me. Mason might never become the person they spent years pretending he was. But none of that was mine to fix anymore. I was no longer the backup child. I was no longer the invisible one. I was no longer living inside someone else's needs. I was finally living for myself, and for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Thanks for listening to this story. If it hit you hard, tell me in the comments what you think, and whether you would have answered that phone call the same way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like this. See you in the next video.